The year is 1881. Aboard the HMS Bacchante, a young Prince George, the future King of England, stands watch on a night as black as ink. Suddenly, off the port bow, a phantom glow cuts through the darkness. It's a brig bathed in a strange spectral red light, its masts and spars stark against the storm-filled sky. 13 men on deck see it. They watch, paralyzed, as the ghost ship drives headlong into the roaring sea. Impossibly fast, impossibly silent. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanishes. The next morning, the sailor who first spotted the apparition is dead, having fallen from the topmast to the deck below. This wasn't a scene from a horror novel. It was an official entry in the royal ship's log. For centuries, sailors, from hardened naval officers to grizzled fishermen, have told the same story. They speak of a glowing skeletal ship, crewed by the damned, that appears in the heart of the world's most violent storms. To see it is an omen of certain doom. But this isn't just a ghost story. It's a mystery tied to a single terrifying question. What unspeakable act could a man commit to be condemned by God, or the devil himself, to sail the oceans for eternity? And what if the truth behind this legend points not to a ghost, but to a cover-up hiding a crime so dark it had to be buried beneath a myth? To understand the curse, you first have to understand the world that created it. The 17th century, the Dutch Golden Age. A time of staggering wealth, ruthless ambition, and brutal competition. At the heart of it all was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. It wasn't just a company. It was a global empire. The world's first multinational corporation, armed with its own army, its own navy, and the power to mint its own money. Its ships, laden with spices, silks, and porcelain from the Far East, were floating treasure chests worth more than a king's ransom. The journey back to Amsterdam was a 9-month ordeal, a perilous gauntlet of pirates, disease, and treacherous weather. But one stretch of water was feared above all others, a place where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans collide in a maelstrom of fury. The sailors didn't call it the Cape of Good Hope. They called it the Cape of Storms. This was the graveyard of ships, a place where the ocean itself seemed hell-bent on swallowing men whole. And it was into this world that a captain was born. His name, as the legend tells it, was Hendrik van der Decken. Van der Decken wasn't just a sailor. He was a master of the sea, a man whose skill was matched only by his obsessive, terrifying ambition. He was known for making impossibly fast voyages, pushing his ship and his crew to the absolute breaking point. He scoffed at danger, laughed in the face of storms, and saw other men's fear as nothing but weakness. To him, the VOC's deadlines weren't suggestions, they were sacred. The cargo in his hold wasn't just merchandise. It was proof of his dominance over the ocean itself. He was a man possessed by a single burning desire, to conquer the Cape of Storms, to tame it, to make the fastest passage in history, no matter the cost. His contemporaries saw him as brilliant but reckless, a man whose pride was so immense it bordered on blasphemy. They had no idea how right they were. The voyage that would seal his fate began like any other. His ship, a magnificent East Indiaman, was loaded to the gills with priceless goods. The pressure from the company was immense. Time was money, and every day spent at sea was a fortune lost. As they approached the southern tip of Africa, the sky turned a sickly shade of green. The barometer plummeted. The sea, once calm, began to heave and boil. Veteran sailors, men who had spent their lives on the water, saw the signs. This wasn't just a storm, it was a monster. A hurricane-force tempest that could tear a ship to splinters in minutes. The crew begged Van der Decken to turn back, to seek shelter in the nearest bay and wait for the storm to pass. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the only thing to do. But Hendrik van der Decken was not a sensible man. He stood on the quarterdeck, the wind tearing at his coat, a wild, manic grin on his face. He saw their pleas not as a warning, but as a challenge. Turning back was for cowards. He was Hendrik van der Decken, and he would not be defeated by wind and water. He ordered more sail. The crew stared in disbelief. It was a suicide order. The masts groaned under the strain, threatening to snap like twigs. Waves the size of buildings crashed over the bow, sweeping men from the deck into the churning black water. The ship was being torn apart piece by piece. Still, the crew pleaded with him. They begged for their lives. They told him he was defying the will of God himself. And that's when it happened. In the heart of the screaming tempest, surrounded by the terror of his dying crew, Decken is said to have climbed onto the railing, his fists raised to the heavens. He was drenched half-mad, consumed by a rage that eclipsed all reason. He cursed the storm. He cursed his crew's cowardice. And then he cursed God. He swore a terrible, blasphemous oath. He declared that he would round the Cape, even if it took him until Judgment Day. He screamed into the wind, challenging the Almighty to sink him. He would not be deterred. He would sail on forever if he had to. According to the legend, the heavens answered. The storm clouds parted for a single terrifying moment, and a ghostly light shone down upon the deck. A figure appeared before Decken. Some say it was an angel of God. Others, the devil himself. The entity accepted his oath. His wish was granted. He would not sink. He would not die. But he would never make port either. He and his ghostly crew were condemned to sail the seas for all eternity, a phantom ship bringing terror and death to all who witnessed them. His pride had cost him his ship, his crew, and his very soul. He was no longer Hendrik Decken. He was the captain of the Flying Dutchman. The curse was specific, a tailor-made hell for a man obsessed with his destination. He is forever sailing but never arriving. He is forever battling the storm that he challenged, locked in an eternal struggle he can never win. His crew, skeletal figures with hollow eyes, are forced to work the ship alongside him, sharing in his damnation. They are said to sometimes hail other vessels, trying to pass off letters to loved ones long dead, letters that can never be delivered. To accept these letters is to invite the curse upon your own ship. To see the Dutchman itself is a prophecy of disaster. Shipwrecks, mutinies, fatal accidents, they all follow in its wake. The ship became more than a story whispered by sailors in smoky taverns. It became a fundamental truth of the sea, a warning etched into the mind of every man who dared to challenge the raw, untamable power of the ocean. It was a perfect horror story, a cautionary tale of hubris punished by divine or demonic force. But as the centuries passed, the sightings didn't stop. They got more frequent, more detailed, and they were being reported by some of the most credible witnesses imaginable, including the future King of England. The legend was evolving from a folk tale into a terrifyingly real phenomenon, and it forces us to ask, what if the curse wasn't the beginning of the story but the end? What if Captain Decken wasn't a sinner punished by God, but a man who was silenced, his ship deliberately sunk, and his story twisted into a supernatural horror to hide a corporate crime so vast it could have brought down an empire? The ghost story may be the lie. The truth could be far, far worse. To understand the crime, you first have to understand the criminal. And in this story, the real villain isn't a man but a machine. A corporate entity so powerful, so vast, it dwarfed nations. We're talking about the Verenigde Oostindische Company, or VOC, the Dutch East India Company. Forget what you know about modern corporations. The VOC wasn't just a company. It was the world's first multinational corporation, and it operated like a sovereign state. It had the power to mint its own coins, to negotiate treaties, to colonize territories, and most importantly, to wage war. It had its own private army of tens of thousands of soldiers and a navy of over 100 warships. At its peak, the Dutch East India Company was worth more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google combined. Adjusted for inflation, its value would be in the trillions of dollars today. This wasn't a business. It was an empire built on spices, silk, and secrets, held together by greed and gunpowder. And an empire like that doesn't tolerate loose ends. It doesn't tolerate rogue agents. And it certainly doesn't tolerate anyone who threatens its bottom line. Now, into this world of immense power and ruthless ambition, steps our captain. While the legend leaves him nameless, a specter at the helm, history gives us a candidate. A 17th century captain named Hendrik Decken. He wasn't some random sailor. Decken was one of the best. A master navigator, a brilliant seaman, known for one thing above all else: speed. In an era where a one-way trip from Amsterdam to the East Indies could take the better part of a year, Decken made the journey in record time. His clients, the wealthy merchants and directors of the VOC, loved him for it. Faster trips meant faster profits. He was the company's golden boy, their ace pilot, pushing his ship and his crew to the absolute limit. His ship, often called the Amsterdam, was a marvel of its time. An East Indiaman. These were not quaint sailing vessels. They were floating fortresses, behemoths of wood and canvas designed to carry immense wealth across treacherous oceans while fending off pirates and rival navies. They were the supertankers and cargo jets of their day, the lifeblood of the VOC's global enterprise. And van der Decken was the best man to command one. He was known to be obsessive, ambitious, and perhaps a little reckless. He was a man who saw obstacles not as barriers, but as challenges to be conquered. Nature, pirates, the limits of his own crew, they were all just variables in an equation he was determined to solve. This brings us to the scene of the crime, the Cape of Good Hope. Long before it was given that optimistic name, sailors knew it by its true one, the Cape of Storms. This wasn't just a turn on a map. It was a mariner's graveyard. Here, the cold, violent Atlantic collides with the warmer Indian Ocean, creating some of the most unpredictable and ferocious weather on the planet. Rogue waves, towering walls of water capable of snapping a ship's mast like a toothpick, can appear out of nowhere. The winds, known as the Cape Doctor, can shift in an instant, turning a calm sea into a boiling cauldron of foam and fury. For centuries, this was the most feared passage in the world. To round the Cape was to gamble with your life, and the ocean floor was littered with the wrecks of those who had lost the bet. This is where the official legend takes root. The story goes that Captain van der Decken, desperate to make good time on his return voyage to Amsterdam, arrived at the Cape only to be met by a terrifying storm. His crew, seeing the churning seas and the black sky, begged him to turn back, to seek shelter in a nearby bay and wait for the weather to pass. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing to do. But van der Decken, blinded by pride and greed, refused. He was on a schedule. He had a reputation to maintain. He allegedly laughed in the face of the storm, lit his pipe, and swore a blasphemous oath. He declared that he would round the Cape, even if it took him until Judgment Day. It was this defiance, this challenge to God himself, that sealed his fate. The heavens opened up, a phantom voice cursed him for his hubris, and his ship was lost to the waves, doomed to sail the seas for eternity as a ghostly omen of disaster. It's a fantastic story. It's dramatic, it's terrifying, and it's the perfect cover-up. Because what if the conflict wasn't between van der Decken and God? What if the real conflict was between van der Decken and his employers, the VOC? Think about it. A man known for his efficiency, for his almost fanatical devotion to speed and profit, does he suddenly throw it all away in a fit of irrational pride? Or was something else going on? Was his haste not about pride, but about desperation? Was he not running from a storm, but from something far more dangerous? Let's re-examine the scene. Van der Decken is returning from the East Indies, specifically from the port of Batavia, the VOC's headquarters in Asia. His ship is loaded to the waterline. The official manifest would list spices, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, worth a fortune back in Europe. But the VOC was an organization rife with corruption. Private trading, smuggling, and dealing in illicit goods were rampant. Captains and high-ranking officials often used the company's ships to transport their own personal, undeclared wealth. Gold, diamonds, priceless artifacts looted from Asian temples. Things that were never meant to be on the company's books. What if van der Decken wasn't just carrying the company's cargo? What if he was carrying a secret? A secret so explosive it could threaten the very foundations of the company. Perhaps he had discovered the extent of the corruption among the VOC's top directors in Batavia. Maybe he had a hidden ledger, a second set of books detailing their theft and embezzlement on a colossal scale. Or maybe it was even darker. Evidence of atrocities, of massacres committed in the Spice Islands to maintain the company's monopoly. Crimes that, if exposed in Amsterdam, could lead to treason charges and executions. Suddenly, his desperation to get home isn't about profit anymore. It's about survival. He's not just a captain. He's a whistleblower. He's carrying evidence that could bring down the most powerful men in the world. And they know it. A message would have been sent ahead, faster than his ship could sail. An order given to any VOC asset in the Atlantic. Stop him. At all costs. The Cape of Storms becomes the perfect assassin. Why send a fleet after him when nature could do the job for you? It provides perfect plausible deniability. You don't need to fire a single cannon. All you need is a little help. A persuaded crew member. A bit of sabotage. A weakened rudder post that will snap under pressure. A deliberately frayed rope in the rigging that will fail at the worst possible moment. A small, undetectable act of treachery that, in the fury of a Cape storm, would be utterly untraceable. The ship goes down, the captain and his evidence disappear beneath the waves, and the official report simply reads, "Lost at sea." A tragic act of God. But that's not enough. Because a wreck, even a deep one, can be found. Survivors can wash ashore. Rumors can persist. So you have to do more than just sink the ship. You have to poison the well. You have to salt the earth. You have to make sure no one ever goes looking for the truth. And how do you do that? You don't just erase the story. You rewrite it. You take the tragedy and you twist it into a terrifying legend. You create a ghost story. You tell every sailor in every port that Decken wasn't a victim. He was a sinner. He didn't just die, he was damned. His ship isn't a wreck to be salvaged. It's a cursed specter to be feared. You turn the site of your crime into haunted ground. The story of the Flying Dutchman becomes a warning, a piece of supernatural propaganda. Don't go near the Cape. Don't sail those waters. Don't ask questions about the ship that went down. It's cursed. Its crew is damned for eternity. It's a ghost ship. It's a story so powerful, so chilling. It infects the minds of sailors for generations, becoming a far more effective deterrent than any patrol fleet. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled wasn't convincing the world he didn't exist. It was convincing the world he was a ghost, so no one would ever look for the body. The VOC buried its secret under a mountain of myth. But what exactly was that secret? A ledger full of names and numbers is one thing, but the scale of this cover-up suggests something more. Something tangible. Something that was physically on board that ship. A cargo so forbidden, so valuable, or so damning that its loss was preferable to its arrival in Amsterdam. What was in the hold of Decken's ship that was worth more than the ship itself, and worth committing murder to conceal? The simplest answer, the one whispered in the taverns of Amsterdam, was gold. Not the company's gold, but stolen gold. Spanish gold. The theory goes that Decken, ever the opportunist, had taken a detour, attacking a Spanish treasure galleon and filling his hold with plunder. A rogue captain committing an act of piracy that, if discovered, would ignite a war between two colonial empires. In this version of the story, the Dutch East India Company itself, the powerful VOC, couldn't afford the scandal. They dispatched a warship, not to help Decken but to sink him, to erase their mistake and send the evidence, the ship, the crew and the Spanish gold, to the bottom of the Atlantic. The pilot Schouten discovering the plan had to be silenced. It's a clean narrative. It has politics, greed and betrayal, but it feels too terrestrial, too simple for a legend that has haunted the oceans for centuries. Because other, darker rumors persist. Rumors that the cargo wasn't treasure, but knowledge. Forbidden texts from the Far East, occult manuscripts that promised power over the elements, or secrets that would shatter the very foundations of the Church in Europe. A cargo so heretical that the religious authorities of the day would have burned not just the captain, but everyone he had ever known. In this scenario, the storm wasn't just a storm. It was a warning. A divine intervention to stop this poison from reaching the shores of Christendom. Decken, in his arrogance, refused to heed the warning. He murdered the pilot not to hide gold, but to protect a secret he believed would make him a god among men. And there is a third possibility, perhaps the most chilling of all, that the cargo wasn't an object but a person. A political prisoner of immense importance. A deposed monarch, a forgotten heir, or a religious prophet whose very existence threatened the ruling order of Europe. Smuggled aboard in secret, this passenger was Decken's real prize, his ticket to unimaginable wealth and influence. The pilot, a man of conscience, discovered the human cargo and threatened to expose the captain. For that, he was thrown to the waves. The ship wasn't just carrying a person, it was carrying a revolution in chains, and the powers that be sent the storm to bury it at sea. Gold, knowledge, or a prisoner. Whatever it was sealed in the hold when the pilot's body hit the water. And that act of murder was the tipping point. It was the moment Captain Decken crossed a line from which there was no return. The sky, which had been menacing, now turned apocalyptic. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. Waves, the size of liquid mountains, rose up not to crash against the ship, but to swallow it whole. The very ocean seemed to recoil in horror at the crime committed upon its surface. The crew, hardened sailors who had seen every terror the sea could offer, were broken. They fell to their knees, praying, begging, pleading with the captain to turn back. They saw the storm for what it was: a judgment, a divine fury unleashed upon them for the sins of their captain. They begged him to seek shelter in a bay, to wait out God's anger, to repent. But Hendrik van der Decken was not a man who repented. He was a man who conquered. He saw the storm not as a judgment but as a challenge, an opponent to be beaten. He lashed himself to the ship's wheel to keep from being washed overboard, his knuckles white, his face a mask of pure, undiluted defiance. The sea ripped the sails to shreds, snapped the masts like twigs, and washed men from the deck with casual, brutal indifference. Through the symphony of splintering wood and dying screams, Van der Decken was heard laughing, a wild, unhinged cackle that cut through the roar of the tempest. He was energized by the chaos, fueled by the destruction. This was his element. As the ship crested a colossal wave, suspended for a moment between the angry heavens and the churning sea, he raised a fist to the sky, and he made his vow. The words have echoed through maritime lore ever since, a blasphemous oath that sealed his fate. He screamed into the wind, "I will round this cape, even if I have to sail until Judgment Day." It was a declaration of war against the forces of nature, against the will of God himself. And according to the legend, something answered. The storm seemed to pause. The wind held its breath. In the eerie sudden silence, a light pierced the black clouds. Some say it was an angelic figure, glowing with divine light, sent to offer one last chance at redemption. Others say the light was a sickly green, and the form that descended upon the deck was the devil himself, drawn by the stench of a soul so ripe with defiance. The entity spoke, its voice the sound of grinding glaciers and ancient stone. It offered Van der Decken a choice: turn back now, repent for the murder of his pilot, and his crew would be spared. He alone would face his punishment. The alternative was to be granted his wish. He would round the cape. He would sail forever. Imagine the scene. A mortal man, drenched and defiant, standing before a supernatural being on the deck of his disintegrating ship, with the souls of his crew hanging in the balance. Any sane man would have fallen to his knees, but Van der Decken was long past sanity. He looked at this specter of judgment and, according to the legend, he drew his pistol. He fired at the apparition, but the bullet passed through it as if through smoke. He then bellowed his final, fatal curse: "I will not. I sail on, and I ask no quarter, and I will give none. I will sail these seas for all eternity." The being vanished, and the storm returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a natural force. It was the instrument of the curse. The sky turned a permanent blood red. The waves glowed with an eerie phosphorescent light. The ship, the Amsterdam, was no longer a vessel of wood and canvas, but a phantom, forever caught in the gale of its captain's damnation. The curse was absolute. Van der Decken was granted his wish. He would sail until Judgment Day, but he would never make port. He would never again know a moment's peace, forever battling a storm that could never be weathered. He and his crew of ghosts were doomed to become a terrifying omen, a portent of doom for any sailor unlucky enough to cross their path. They became a fixture of the sea itself, as real as the tides and as feared as the kraken. And part of their curse was a desperate, eternal loneliness. They were compelled to try and make contact with the living, to pass on letters to loved ones long dead, letters written on ghostly parchment that would bring misfortune to anyone who accepted them. They were trapped in a loop, forever reliving their final terrifying moments, their spectral ship cutting through the waves, its tattered sails straining against a phantom wind, its crew of skeletons endlessly working the ropes. The Flying Dutchman was born, not from a simple shipwreck, but from a tapestry of damnation woven from greed, murder, and one man's unbreakable, unforgivable pride. The legend was now forged in the fires of supernatural wrath. The story of Captain Van der Decken was no longer just a cautionary tale told by sailors. It was a ghost story, a promise of a real, tangible horror that stalked the world's most dangerous waters. The curse was sealed. Van der Decken and his crew were no longer men, but a phantom echo trapped between worlds. But a ghost story is only as good as its witnesses. And soon the sightings would begin. For centuries, it was a story told in hushed tones in the forecastles of ships, a whispered warning exchanged over rum in smoky port taverns, a tale to frighten greenhorn sailors and remind old salts of the ocean's unforgiving nature. The story of the Flying Dutchman was sea foam and shadow, a myth meant to explain the unexplainable, the sudden squall on a clear day, the rogue wave from a calm sea, the chilling feeling of being watched in the middle of a vast empty ocean. But then the whispers began to take shape, the shadows started to coalesce, and the sightings began to be logged in the meticulous, unforgiving ink of ships' journals. The first accounts were fragmented, easily dismissed as the ravings of sun-scorched, half-starved men. A Dutch trading vessel in the 1700s reports seeing a ship sailing hard against a gale, its sails full when theirs were torn to ribbons. They described it as glowing with an unnatural sickly green light, a vessel that moved with impossible speed, cutting through mountainous waves as if they were placid lake water. The crew watched in horror as it passed, close enough to see the gaunt, skeletal figures on its deck, their faces twisted in eternal agony. The next day, a fever tore through their ship, claiming a third of the crew. Coincidence? Perhaps. But sailors are a superstitious breed. They know the sea keeps its own ledgers of debt and damnation. Then came other reports, trickling in from every corner of the globe where the winds howled and the waters were treacherous. An English merchantman off the coast of Africa, limping home with a broken mast, saw it. A phantom brig, sails glowing a deathly white, appeared on the horizon. It didn't sail on the water, but seemed to hover just above it, wreathed in a cold mist that didn't belong in the sweltering equatorial heat. It sailed towards them, and as it drew near, the lookout swore he could hear the frantic shrieking of commands in a language he didn't understand, the crack of a whip and the clatter of chains. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving behind nothing but an unnerving, bone-deep chill and the stench of decay on the wind. That merchantman never made it to port. It was found weeks later, adrift and empty, its crew vanished without a trace. These stories became part of the fabric of life at sea. The Flying Dutchman wasn't just a ghost ship. It was a harbinger. To sea it was a death sentence. It meant your ship was doomed. It meant a storm was coming that would splinter your keel and send you to the bottom. It meant your voyage was cursed, and you would never see your home or your family again. It was the ultimate omen, the ocean's own grim reaper, come to collect its due. For decades these were just stories. Terrifying, yes, but still just stories. They were easy for the Admiralty, for the shipping companies, for the men in their comfortable offices on dry land to dismiss. They were the products of exhaustion, malnutrition, isolation, and fear. The ocean plays tricks on the mind, they'd say. It's a mirage. It's St. Elmo's fire, that strange electrical phenomenon that makes the masts of ships glow. It's a fog bank catching the moonlight in a peculiar way. There was always a rational scientific explanation. Until July 11, 1881, because on that night, the Flying Dutchman was not seen by a lone, frightened sailor on a forgotten merchant vessel. It was seen by 13 men aboard a British Royal Navy warship, the HMS Bacchante, and 2 of those men were the grandsons of the most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria, Prince Albert Victor, and his younger brother, the 16-year-old midshipman Prince George, the man who would one day be crowned King George V of England. The Bacchante was on a 3-year tour, sailing between Melbourne and Sydney, Australia. The night was clear, the sea calm. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the deadest hour of the watch, a cry went up from the lookout. The official ship's log, later published for the world to see, records the event with chilling clarity. It reads, "The Flying Dutchman crossed our bows, a strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, spars, and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief as she came up on our port bow." Imagine being on that deck. The salty air, the creak of the ship, the gentle lap of the waves. And then that sight. Not a dim, distant light, but a vessel, close enough to see its rigging, its form, its impossible nature. It wasn't lit by lanterns. The entire ship was the source of the light, a burning blood-red phosphorescence that illuminated every spar, every rope, every tattered sail. It was moving fast on a collision course, yet it made no sound. No creak of timber, no rush of water at its bow. A silent, burning apparition. The officer of the watch and the quarterdeck midshipmen were sent forward to investigate, to see what this strange vessel was. But as they approached the ship's bow, it was gone. Vanished. It hadn't sailed away into the darkness. It had simply ceased to exist, leaving only the calm, empty sea and the stunned silence of 13 witnesses, including 2 future kings. But the curse of the Dutchman is not a passive thing. An omen once seen must be fulfilled. The story doesn't end with the vanishing of the light. The log entry continues. The sailor who had first sighted the phantom ship, the lookout who had made that fateful cry, was sent aloft to furl a sail. As the crew watched from the deck below, he lost his footing. Without a sound, he fell from the topgallant yardarm, plunging over 100 feet to the deck. He was killed instantly. The first price had been paid. The curse, however, was not yet satisfied. A few weeks later, the admiral in command of the naval squadron, a man in perfect health when the Dutchman was sighted, fell suddenly and violently ill. He died. The second price. This was the moment the legend changed forever. It was no longer a sailor's superstition. It was now a documented naval incident, recorded in an official log, and witnessed by royalty. The account of Prince George and the crew of the HMS Bacchante was published in newspapers from London to New York to Sydney. It was discussed in gentlemen's clubs and studied by paranormal investigators. The skeptics could no longer wave it away so easily. How could 13 men, including sober, trained naval officers and a future monarch, all hallucinate the exact same thing? How could they all imagine a glowing red brig that appeared from nowhere and vanished into thin air? And how do you explain the sudden tragic deaths that followed in its wake? The sighting by the HMS Bacchante cemented the Flying Dutchman's place in history. It transformed Captain Decken's ghost from a campfire tale into a terrifyingly real phenomenon. It proved to many that there was something out there, a phantom ship crewed by the damned, sailing the seas for eternity. But the legend had another, even more disturbing layer. The Dutchman wasn't just a passive omen of doom to be witnessed from afar. Sometimes the ghost ship would try to make contact. Its desperate, damned crew would attempt to reach out to the living, to pass on messages from a world of shadow, letters from men who had been dead for centuries. And for any sailor foolish enough to accept them, a fate worse than death awaited. This was the Dutchman's curse, not just for its own crew, but for any soul unlucky enough to cross its spectral path. The offer of letters was a trap, a poisoned chalice offered by the damned. Imagine the scene: your own ship battered by a relentless storm, miles from any known port. And then through the shrieking wind and crashing waves you see it. An impossible ship, sails black against the lightning, bearing down on you. A small boat is lowered from its side, manned by gaunt, silent figures with hollow eyes that seem to drink the very light from the air. They don't speak. They don't have to. They simply hold out a bundle of letters, sealed with black wax and reeking of the deep, cold ocean floor. These letters were addressed to the living, yes, but more often they were for the dead. For wives and children who had long since grown old and passed away. For parents who had turned to dust in forgotten churchyards. To accept these messages was to accept a package from hell itself. It was an invitation. By taking the letters, a sailor was forging a link between his world and theirs, between the living and the eternally lost. The legend says that any ship that accepted this cursed mail was never seen again. It was as if the Dutchman's doom was contagious, a spectral plague that could leap from one vessel to another, dragging a new crew down into the same watery, unending purgatory. But what of the men on board the Dutchman? What did they look like, these wretched souls shackled to their phantom captain? They were not simply ghosts in the way we imagine them, transparent and ethereal. The sea had claimed them, body and soul, and remade them in its own terrifying image. Their skin, it was said, had a pale greenish luminescence, like the phosphorescence that glows in a ship's wake on a moonless night. Their hair was matted with seaweed, their beards tangled with tiny dead sea creatures. Barnacles grew on their flesh as if it were rotted timber. And their eyes were the worst part. They held a bottomless despair, an agony stretched out over centuries. They would stare at the living sailors on other ships, their mouths working silently, trying to form words that would never come, a desperate plea for a release that was forever denied them. They were prisoners, not just on a ship, but within their own decaying bodies, forced to work the rigging and man the sails for a captain whose madness had damned them all. They were the living embodiment of a sailor's worst fear. Not a quick death in a storm, but to be lost at sea forever. And at the helm of this floating charnel house stood the captain himself, Hendrik van der Decken. His punishment was the cruelest of all. While his crew was bound by his curse, he was bound by his own blasphemous oath. He was the architect of their hell, and he was forced to watch it, to live it every single second of every single day for eternity. The wind that filled his sails was the very breath of his damnation, the salt spray on his face a constant reminder of his failure. He wasn't just sailing, he was suffering. The legend evolved to include a torment perfectly tailored to a man defined by his reckless pride and love of gambling. In his unending despair, adrift on a timeless ocean, the captain was said to have one recurring visitor. One night, with the storm at its fiercest and his hope at its lowest ebb, a figure is said to have appeared on his quarterdeck. Some say it was the devil himself, others say it was a personification of his own damnation. This entity offered the captain a game, a chance to win back his soul. The game was dice. The stakes were simple. If Decken won, his curse would be lifted, and he and his crew would finally know the peace of death. If he lost, his torment would be sealed, and he would become the devil's own agent on the high seas, a ferryman of doom. The dice, some stories claim, were carved from human knucklebone, and the cup they were thrown from was a human skull. On the storm-lashed deck of his ghost ship, surrounded by his silent, suffering crew, Captain Decken played for a prize greater than any treasure: his own salvation. He threw the dice, and he lost. Of course he lost. You can't win a game when the devil holds all the cards, or in this case all the dice. With that final fateful roll, Decken's fate was cemented. He was no longer just a cursed captain. He was an instrument of evil. His ship was no longer just a lost vessel. It was a weapon. This is why the Flying Dutchman became more than just a ghost story. It became an omen of the highest order. To see it was not just a strange or spooky encounter, it was a death sentence. The appearance of the Dutchman on the horizon meant that a storm was coming, a storm that your ship would not survive. It meant that your vessel was marked for the bottom of the sea. The ghostly light emanating from its decks was said to be St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon that sailors already regarded with a mixture of awe and dread. But when it appeared on the Dutchman, it was no longer a natural wonder. It was the fire of hell itself, illuminating the path to your own watery grave. Sailors would change course, sometimes sailing hundreds of miles out of their way, just to avoid waters where the Dutchman was rumored to have been seen. The legend became a living, breathing part of maritime culture, a boogeyman for an entire global industry. It was a story that perfectly encapsulated the anxieties of life at sea. The terrifying power of the weather, the crushing isolation, the fear of being forgotten by the world, and the nagging suspicion that some sins once committed could never be forgiven. The story was a warning against hubris, against challenging the natural order, against defying God. Decken wasn't just a sailor. He was a symbol of mankind's arrogance, a modern Icarus who flew too close to the sun, not with wings of wax, but with a heart full of pride and a ship full of timber. His eternal punishment was a cautionary tale whispered in every port from Amsterdam to the East Indies. But over time, something strange began to happen. The story started to leak out of the realm of folklore. It stopped being a tale you tell over a tankard of ale to scare the new cabin boy. The sightings became more frequent, more detailed, and the people reporting them were not just superstitious, uneducated sailors. They were naval officers. They were experienced captains. They were men of science and reason, men who were not prone to flights of fancy. The lines began to blur between a terrifying legend and a terrifying reality. Was it possible that this was more than just a story? Could a ship, crewed by the dead and captained by a man who lost a game of dice with the devil, actually be haunting the world's oceans? The tale was about to take a shocking turn, as the ghost ship sailed out of the mists of legend and into the logbooks of history. For centuries, sailors had whispered the name of the Flying Dutchman in hushed tones, a boogeyman of the high seas, a campfire story told to frighten new recruits. It was a myth, a legend, a cautionary tale. But on July 11, 1881, in the cold, dark waters between Melbourne and Sydney, Australia, that all changed. On that night, the legend was seen. And it was seen by witnesses so credible, so unimpeachable, that the world had no choice but to listen. The witnesses were the crew of the HMS Bacchante, and among them were two young men who were destined for greatness, or in one case, infamy: Prince Albert Victor and his younger brother, the future King George V of England. Imagine the scene. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. The sea is calm, but the night is absolute, a black velvet void punctuated only by the stars and the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. The two young princes are on deck, midshipmen learning the ropes of the Royal Navy. Suddenly, a strange light appears on the port bow. It's not a star, And it's not another ship's lantern. It's a phantom red light, an unnatural glow that seems to illuminate the impossible. As their eyes adjust, they see it. A brig, a two-masted sailing ship cutting through the water. But this was no ordinary vessel. Every mast, every spar, every rope was bathed in that same eerie phosphorescent red glow. It stood out against the pitch-black night like a burning ember, a ship-shaped specter sailing on a sea of ink. Prince George recorded the event in his official log, his words echoing with a sense of chilling awe. He wrote, "The lookout man on the forecastle reported her as close on the port bow, where also the officer of the watch from the bridge clearly saw her. A strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, spars and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief as she came up on the port bow. 13 men in total witnessed the apparition. 13 members of the British Royal Navy, including 2 heirs to the throne. This wasn't some drunken sailor's yarn. This was a documented event, recorded in the logbook of a royal vessel. The phantom ship sailed on, paying them no mind, and vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. But the legend of the Flying Dutchman carried with it a deadly warning. To see the ship was to invite doom upon your own. For the crew of the HMS Bacchante, the curse didn't wait long to claim its first victim. Later that very morning at 10:45 a.m., the seaman who had first spotted the ghost ship, the lookout on the forecastle, lost his footing. He fell from the topgallant masthead, plummeting towards the deck below. He was killed instantly. The omen had been fulfilled. The curse was real, and it wasn't finished. Soon after the incident, the admiral of the fleet, who had been aboard the Bacchante, fell ill with a mysterious sickness and died. 2 deaths directly following the sighting. Coincidence? For the terrified crew, it was proof. They had been marked by the Dutchman. This royal encounter catapulted the legend from maritime folklore into the public consciousness. If the future King of England saw it, who was anyone to argue? And his wasn't an isolated report. Suddenly, it seemed the Dutchman was everywhere. Other reputable sailors and ships began to come forward with their own chilling encounters. In 1835, the captain and crew of a British vessel named the Orion were rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the Dutchman's home turf, when they spotted a ship in the distance, sailing directly into a fierce gale. The weather was so violent that the Orion had been forced to reef its sails, yet this other vessel was under full sail, seemingly unaffected by the hurricane-force winds. Believing the ship to be in distress, the captain of the Orion ordered his crew to prepare for a rescue. They watched in horror as the mystery ship bore down on them, on a direct collision course. They prepared for impact, for the splintering of wood and the screams of dying men. But just as it was about to strike, the ship vanished. It simply wasn't there anymore. The crew of the Orion, shaken to their core, later reported the incident. When they described the vessel, old salts in the port knew the name instantly, the Flying Dutchman. Decades later, in 1879, the crew of the HMS Tourmalin witnessed a similar phantom, a ghostly, full-rigged ship, appearing out of nowhere in the middle of the ocean. It was so clear that the crew could make out its masts and yards. But just like the others, it disappeared without a trace, leaving the sailors to question their own sanity. Then there was the report from the Swedish bark, the Uno, whose crew saw the Dutchman with its tattered sails and ghostly crew, a vision that left them paralyzed with fear. The sightings weren't just confined to the 19th century or to those at sea. The legend followed humanity into the 20th century, proving its terrifying endurance. In 1939, dozens of beachgoers at Glencairn Beach, just outside Cape Town, South Africa, were treated to a horrifying spectacle. On a clear, calm day, they saw a 17th-century sailing ship, a vessel centuries out of time, gliding across the water under full sail. It was so vivid, so real that people gathered in a crowd pointing and shouting. They watched for hours as it sailed towards the horizon, a perfect silhouette against the setting sun. And then, in a single heart-stopping moment, it vanished. Gone. As if it had never been there at all. So what are we to make of this? Are these all just tall tales, mass hallucinations, or something more? We have a future king, Royal Navy crews, seasoned merchant sailors, and crowds of ordinary people all swearing they saw the same impossible thing. It's easy to dismiss a single story, but when the reports pile up, year after year, decade after decade, from credible sources all over the world, you have to start asking different questions. You have to start looking for an explanation. And science, ever the patient debunker of myths, believes it has one. The answer, scientists say, may lie not on the water, but in the air itself. They point to a bizarre and beautiful atmospheric phenomenon known as a fata morgana. It's a type of superior mirage, an incredibly complex optical illusion that occurs when light passes through layers of air at different temperatures. The air acts like a lens, bending and distorting the light from distant objects. It can make a ship that is actually far over the horizon appear to be floating in the sky, or hovering just above the water. It can stretch, compress, and invert the image, making a simple fishing boat look like a towering multi-masted galleon from a bygone era. This isn't just a theory, it's a documented phenomenon. The conditions needed for a fata morgana to occur, a sharp temperature inversion, where a layer of warm air sits on top of a layer of cold air, are incredibly common in the open ocean, especially in polar regions or in places like the Cape of Good Hope, where cold and warm ocean currents collide. It's the perfect breeding ground for mirages. A fata morgana could easily explain why a ship might appear to be sailing against the wind, or why it might vanish in an instant as the atmospheric conditions shift. It explains the ghostly, distorted appearance. And what about the eerie red glow that Prince George and his crewmates described? There's a possible explanation for that too: bioluminescence. Certain types of plankton and algae in the ocean can produce their own light, a phenomenon sometimes called sea fire or milky seas. When disturbed by a ship's hull, these microorganisms can light up the water around it, bathing the vessel in a ghostly, otherworldly glow. A glow that could very easily be described as a strange phantom red. So, is that it? Is the legendary Flying Dutchman, the terror of the seven seas, nothing more than a trick of the light? A combination of a mirage and glowing plankton? It's a neat, tidy explanation. It appeals to our rational minds. It puts the ghost back in the storybook where it belongs. But it leaves a few nagging questions unanswered. A fata morgana can explain what the sailors saw, but it can't explain what happened next. It can't explain the curse. It can't explain the lookout on the HMS Bacchante falling to his death just hours after the sighting. It can't explain the Admiral's sudden demise. Are those just tragic coincidences, their significance amplified by superstitious minds? Or did those 13 men on the deck of the Bacchante truly witness a harbinger of death? A malevolent force that science has no way to measure, and no power to explain? That is the question that haunts the legend, the razor's edge between a chilling ghost story and a tragic misunderstanding. To find an answer, we have to pull back from the fog of superstition and look at the world through the eyes of science. Because for every sailor who swore they saw a phantom ship, there is a rational scientific explanation that is, in its own way, just as mind-bending and spectacular as any ghost. The most powerful of these explanations is a phenomenon known as a fata morgana. This isn't your everyday desert mirage of a shimmering oasis. A fata morgana is a superior mirage, an incredibly complex and rare optical event that occurs almost exclusively over large bodies of water, like the open ocean or in polar regions. It happens when a thermal inversion occurs, a strange atmospheric condition where a layer of cold, dense air sits close to the sea, and a layer of warmer, less dense air rests on top of it. This boundary between the cold and warm air acts like a refracting lens, a massive invisible piece of glass floating in the sky. Now imagine a real ship, made of wood and steel, sailing peacefully dozens, maybe even 100 miles away, completely over the horizon and utterly invisible to the naked eye. The light reflecting off that ship travels upwards, hits this atmospheric lens, and is then bent or refracted back down towards an observer who is even farther away. What that observer sees is not the real ship. They see a projected image of it hanging impossibly in the air, right where the sky meets the sea. And this image is not stable. It's a phantom, because the layers of air are constantly shifting and undulating. The projected image is warped, stretched, and compressed. A ship can appear to float upside down, or be stretched vertically to look like a ghostly skyscraper. It can appear to shimmer, to vibrate, to sail through the clouds themselves. It can appear and disappear in the blink of an eye as the atmospheric conditions change. Sound familiar? A ship sailing against the wind, high above the waves, appearing as a distorted, wavering silhouette before vanishing without a trace. It is the perfect description of the Flying Dutchman. A fata morgana could easily account for the most famous sightings, including the one witnessed by Prince George and his crew. The ship they saw wasn't a ghost. It was likely a real vessel, far over the horizon, its image teleported across the sky by a trick of the light. Then there's the matter of the Dutchman's infamous eerie glow. Sailors often described it as being lit by a ghostly, supernatural light. Here again, science offers a compelling answer. Bioluminescence and St. Elmo's fire. The ocean is filled with billions of microscopic organisms called dinoflagellates. When disturbed, they emit a flash of blue-green light. A ship's wake, a school of fish, or even a surfacing whale can trigger a massive, silent explosion of this cold, spectral light, making it seem as if the ocean itself is glowing from within. To a sailor on a dark night, seeing a distant patch of ocean suddenly illuminate with an otherworldly luminescence, perhaps outlining the shape of a wave that looks like a hull, could easily be mistaken for a phantom vessel. Even more dramatic is St. Elmo's fire. This is a weather phenomenon where a powerful electrical field, often before or after a thunderstorm, causes the air itself to ionize and create a glowing plasma. This plasma is drawn to pointed objects, like the masts and yardarms of a wooden sailing ship. Sailors would witness balls of blue or violet fire dancing on the tips of their masts, crawling along the rigging with a faint hissing sound. It was a terrifying and awe-inspiring sight, often interpreted as a divine or demonic omen. Now, imagine seeing this phenomenon on another ship during a storm. You'd see a vessel whose masts and sails are literally on fire, but not burning. A ship wreathed in a cold electric flame. It's the perfect recipe for a legend of a damned, cursed vessel, glowing with the fires of hell. But the explanations aren't just atmospheric. They're also psychological. We have to remember the mindset of a 17th or 18th century sailor. You are profoundly isolated, a tiny speck of wood and cloth in a vast, indifferent wilderness of water. Your world is one of constant, backbreaking labor, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Storms can rise from nowhere and tear your world apart. Your diet is atrocious, often leading to malnutrition and diseases like scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that we now know can cause confusion, paranoia, and vivid hallucinations. Your mind, weakened by exhaustion, poor nutrition, and fear, is desperately trying to make sense of a hostile and unpredictable environment. You are steeped in folklore and superstition. You've grown up hearing stories of krakens, sea serpents, and of course the Flying Dutchman. The story is already in your head. So on a long, monotonous night watch, staring into the disorienting grayness of a thick fog bank, your pattern-seeking brain goes into overdrive. You see a strangely shaped cloud, a reflection of the moon on a distant wave, or perhaps the distorted image of a Fata Morgana. Your mind, already primed by the legend, doesn't see a cloud or a reflection, sees what it expects to see, sees what it fears to see, sees a ship, and fear is contagious. One sailor, tired and suggestible, cries out. He points. The others rush to look, their own adrenaline surging. They stare into the same ambiguous shape, and the power of suggestion does the rest. They too see the masts, the tattered sails. The shared delusion crystallizes into a shared memory. They didn't just think they saw a ghost ship. They know they did. They will carry that story to the next port, where it will be told and retold, each telling cementing the legend a little deeper into the collective consciousness of the seafaring world. It's a feedback loop of fear, folklore, and human psychology, played out on the loneliest stage on Earth. So when you combine these powerful forces, the spectacular optical illusions of a Fata Morgana, the eerie glow of bioluminescence in St. Elmo's fire, and the psychological pressures of isolation, malnutrition, and mass hysteria, you have a recipe that explains nearly every single element of the Flying Dutchman legend. It's a case of mistaken identity on a grand scale, where nature's most bizarre tricks are misinterpreted by the human mind's greatest weaknesses. The phantom ship is real, but it's not a ghost of wood and sail. It's a ghost created by light, weather, and fear. These explanations are clean. They're logical. They tie up the loose ends and seem to solve the mystery. They explain the shimmering apparitions, the ghostly glows, the sense of dread. But there's a problem with explaining away a legend. Legends are more than just mistaken sightings. They have a life of their own. These scientific explanations, as compelling as they are, don't fully account for the sheer endurance of the story. Why this one specific legend? Why Captain van der Straten, or van der Decken? Why the Cape of Good Hope? And most importantly, these explanations don't address what happened when the legend left the high seas and sailed into the ports of human culture. Because the story of the Flying Dutchman didn't just terrify sailors, It began to inspire poets, playwrights, and composers, evolving from a simple sailor's yarn into one of the most powerful and enduring myths of the modern world, a symbol of eternal wandering and damnation that would echo in concert halls and opera houses for centuries to come. And in the grand opera houses of 19th century Europe, that echo became a roar. The legend of the Flying Dutchman had found its perfect moment. The Romantic era was in full swing, a period defined by a fascination with the sublime, the supernatural, and the untamed power of nature. Artists and writers were turning away from the neat, orderly logic of the Enlightenment and embracing emotion, individualism, and a deep sense of historical melancholy. They were obsessed with folk tales, ancient myths, and stories of cursed, tormented heroes. The ghostly captain trapped between life and death, sailing a sea of eternal despair, was not just a scary story anymore. He was the ultimate romantic anti-hero. Before the legend reached its operatic peak, it first conquered the stage. In 1826, the London Adelphi Theatre premiered a melodrama titled The Flying Dutchman, or The Phantom Ship by Edward Fitzball. It was a smash hit. This wasn't a subtle psychological drama, it was a spectacle. Audiences were treated to thunderous sound effects, flashes of lightning across the stage, and the terrifying vision of the phantom ship itself, with its skeletal crew and glowing blood-red sails. Fitzball's version introduced a new, crucial element to the story, a magic relic. The captain, here named Decken, could only find peace if a holy relic he possessed was returned to the sea by a woman who would be true to him unto death. This added a quest, a tangible goal, and a romantic entanglement that made the story more palatable and structured for a theatrical audience. It was a ghost story, yes, but it was also now a gothic romance, a tale of a cursed man and the woman who could potentially save him. The play was so successful it spawned imitators and adaptations across Europe, each one adding its own little twist. But these were all just opening acts for the main event, because in 1843, the legend was taken up by a composer who would redefine not only the myth of the Flying Dutchman, but the very art of opera itself, Richard Wagner. For Wagner, the Dutchman was not just a character. It was a deeply personal obsession. The story goes that in 1839, Wagner was himself a fugitive, fleeing creditors from his post in Riga. He, his wife Minna, and their Newfoundland dog boarded a small vessel, the Thetis, to sail for London. The voyage was a nightmare. They were battered by a ferocious storm in the North Sea, a storm so violent the captain was forced to seek shelter in a Norwegian fjord. Huddled in the cabin, listening to the wind howl and the waves crash against the hull, Wagner heard the sailors' voices echoing off the cliffs. The raw, terrifying power of the sea imprinted itself on his mind. It was during this harrowing journey, he later claimed, that the legend of the Flying Dutchman, a story he'd read in a satirical novel by Heinrich Heine, took hold of his imagination and refused to let go. He saw himself in the cursed captain, a restless wanderer, an outcast artist, forever seeking a home, a port in the storm of life. When he finally sat down to write his opera, Der Fliegende Holländer, he poured all of that personal turmoil and artistic ambition into the score. Wagner's opera transformed the Dutchman from a terrifying bogeyman into a figure of profound tragedy and pathos. This isn't just a ghost. He is a man in agony. The opera opens with one of the most powerful overtures ever written, a musical tempest that throws the listener directly into the heart of the storm. You can hear the shrieking wind in the strings, the crashing waves in the brass, and then, a dark, brooding melody emerges, the Dutchman's theme, a musical signature of eternal suffering and longing. Wagner's story centers on a bargain the captain made with Satan. He is condemned to sail the seas forever, but with one small mercy. Every 7 years, he is allowed to come ashore. If he can find a woman who will be faithful to him until death, her love will break the curse and grant him salvation. If not, he is damned to another 7 years of torment at sea. As the opera begins, another 7 years have passed, and the Dutchman's ship drops anchor in a Norwegian bay, right next to the vessel of a sea captain named Daland. The Dutchman, weary beyond words, offers Daland his entire treasure, chests overflowing with gold and jewels, in exchange for a single night's lodging. But more importantly, he asks about Daland's daughter. Her name is Sinta, and Sinta is no ordinary girl. She is obsessed with the legend of the Flying Dutchman. While the other village girls sit at their spinning wheels, singing songs of their sweethearts, Sinta stares at a portrait of the ghostly captain that hangs in her home. She sings them his ballad, a haunting song that tells his story of damnation and his desperate search for redemption. She feels a mystical connection to this tormented figure, declaring to her horrified friends that she will be the one to save him. It's a powerful, almost disturbing scene. Senta represents a new kind of heroine, one driven not by simple love, but by a consuming, almost fanatical empathy for a suffering soul. She doesn't just want to marry a man. She wants to redeem a myth. When her father returns, bringing with him a dark, mysterious stranger, Senta looks from the portrait to the man standing before her and knows instantly who he is. The two are locked in one of opera's most intense and mesmerizing duets. They are two halves of a whole. He, the eternal wanderer who has given up all hope. She, the steadfast anchor who has been waiting for him her entire life. He sees in her the angel of his salvation. She sees in him the embodiment of her destiny. They pledge their undying love and faithfulness. For a moment, it seems the curse will finally be broken. But this is a tragedy. Senta's former suitor, Eric, confronts her, reminding her of her past promises to him. The Dutchman overhears this and, believing Senta is unfaithful like all the others, falls into despair. He thinks she is now damned along with him. To save her from this fate, he rushes back to his ship, revealing his true identity as the cursed Flying Dutchman to the horrified villagers. He orders his ghostly crew to set sail, convinced he is doomed to wander the seas alone forever. But Senta refuses to let him go. In the opera's climactic moment, she climbs to the top of a cliff overlooking the sea. Crying out that she has been faithful unto death, she throws herself into the raging waves. Her sacrifice is the ultimate act of redemptive love. The curse is broken. The phantom ship, with its blood-red sails, finally sinks beneath the waves, and the transfigured souls of Senta and the Dutchman are seen ascending to heaven. With this opera, Wagner did more than just tell a ghost story. He created a profound psychological drama about alienation, sacrifice, and the search for meaning in a godless world. He codified the legend, solidifying the captain's name as the Dutchman, establishing the 7-year cycle, and most importantly, introducing the theme of redemption through love. This idea that a man's damnation could be undone by the selfless devotion of a faithful woman was a core romantic ideal, and it became inextricably linked with the Flying Dutchman myth forever after. Wagner's tormented, soul-searching captain became the definitive version, overshadowing the simpler, more monstrous specter of sailor folklore. He was no longer just a warning to other sailors. He was a symbol of humanity's deepest spiritual anxieties and its most profound hopes for salvation. And as the curtain fell on Wagner's tragic hero, you might expect the story of the Flying Dutchman to recede from the high seas into the quiet halls of culture, becoming a relic of a bygone era. The age of sail, the very world that had birthed the legend, was dying. Iron hulls were replacing wooden planks, and black plumes of smoke from steam engines were beginning to choke out the great white sails. A ghost ship powered by wind and damned by God seemed destined to become an anachronism, a quaint story told by old men about a world that no longer existed. But the ocean is patient, and the ghosts it keeps are not so easily dismissed by progress. The legend didn't die. It adapted. It waited. And then in the dead of night, it reappeared, not on a stage, but in the logbook of the future King of England. The year is 1881. Aboard the Royal Navy vessel HMS Bacchante, 2 young princes are on a 3-year tour of the British Empire. They are Prince Albert Victor and his younger brother Prince George, the man who would one day become King George V. In the early hours of July 11th, as the Bacchante sailed through the Bay Strait between Melbourne and Sydney, Australia, something impossible happened. The official ship's log, later published, records the event with chilling clarity. At 4 a.m. the entry reads, "The Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. A strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, spars and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief as she came up on the port bow." Imagine the scene. A royal vessel, the pinnacle of British naval power, suddenly confronted by a specter from the past. This wasn't a lone drunken sailor spinning a yarn. This was an account witnessed by 13 men, including a future monarch. The log continues, noting that the midshipman on watch was sent to the forecastle to investigate, but he saw nothing of the ship, only the eerie red glow. The phantom vessel had vanished as quickly as it appeared. The night returned to normal, but the Dutchman's curse, as the old stories warned, had already been delivered. The log entry concludes with a stark, terrifying postscript. At 10:45 a.m. the ordinary seaman who had this morning reported the Flying Dutchman fell from the foretopmast crosstrees onto the topgallant forecastle and was smashed to atoms. The sailor who first saw the ghost ship was dead by midday. The admiral in command of the squadron would also die not long after, succumbing to a sudden illness. Coincidence? Perhaps. But for the sailors of the world, this was proof. The story exploded across the globe. It was no longer a folktale whispered in taverns. It was an officially documented royal encounter. The credibility of the witnesses, especially Prince George, cemented the Flying Dutchman in the modern imagination not as a myth, but as a genuine, terrifying phenomenon. The ghost of Captain van der Straeten had successfully crossed the threshold from folklore into recorded history. And the sightings continued, undeterred by the march of technology. In 1923, the crew of the British liner Glencairn, a modern steamship, reported seeing a ghostly sailing vessel with 4 masts moving at an impossible speed against the wind. The ship was glowing with a faint, otherworldly light, and every detail, from its rigging to the cut of its sails, appeared to be from the 17th century. It was seen by the second mate, who called the captain to the bridge. They watched it together, a silent, luminous relic sailing through the night, before it vanished. Even the crucible of global conflict couldn't banish the phantom captain. During the Second World War, a period of ultimate rationality and brutal mechanical warfare, the Dutchman was sighted multiple times by Allied sailors in the waters off Cape Town. More bizarrely, the legend even found its way into the logs of their enemies. Karl Donitz, the Grand Admiral of the Nazi U-boat fleet, allegedly made a note in his war diary of an encounter his submarine crew had with a spectral galleon near the Cape of Good Hope. The idea of a silent 17th-century ghost ship gliding through a sea prowled by steel wolf packs is a testament to the legend's incredible power to endure. It seems that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, the deep, dark ocean will always hold a place for its oldest and most terrifying ghost. So what are we to make of this? Are these all hoaxes? Mass hallucinations? Or is there something else at play? For every believer, there is a skeptic, and science offers a compelling, if less romantic, explanation for the phantom of the high seas. A breathtaking optical illusion known as a fata morgana. The name itself, taken from the Arthurian sorceress Morgan Le Fay, hints at its magical, deceptive nature. A fata morgana is a type of superior mirage. It occurs when a layer of cold, dense air sits near the surface of the sea, with a layer of warmer, less dense air above it. This phenomenon, called a thermal inversion, creates a lens in the atmosphere. Light rays from an object on or even below the horizon, like a ship, are bent downwards as they pass through this atmospheric lens. To an observer, this bending light makes the distant object appear to be floating in the sky, high above its actual position. The image is often severely distorted. It can be stretched vertically, making a small boat look like a towering galleon. It can be inverted, shimmering upside down above the water. It can be stacked, with multiple images appearing one on top of the other. And because the air itself is in constant motion, the mirage shimmers and flickers, seeming to appear and disappear in an instant. Now, think back to the descriptions of the Flying Dutchman. A ship that appears suddenly on the horizon. A vessel that seems to float above the waves. A silent, ethereal form that vanishes without a trace. The Fata Morgana fits this description almost perfectly. A real ship, perhaps a simple fishing vessel miles below the horizon and completely invisible to the naked eye, could be projected into the sky by this trick of the light, appearing as a ghostly, distorted apparition to a distant crew. The waters around the Cape of Good Hope are particularly notorious for the atmospheric conditions that create these powerful mirages. It's entirely possible that for centuries, sailors have been seeing not a ghost, but a complex and beautiful atmospheric phenomenon. Other natural occurrences could explain other parts of the legend. The eerie glow? That could be St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon in which plasma creates a bright glow, often seen on the masts of ships during a thunderstorm. Or it could be bioluminescent algae, which can cause the sea to glow with a ghostly light, an effect known as a milky sea. And then there's the human element, the psychology of a sailor in the 18th or 19th century. Imagine being isolated for months on end, facing brutal storms, malnutrition, and the constant threat of death. You are exhausted, you are superstitious, and you have grown up hearing the story of the cursed Dutchman. In the dead of night, In the middle of a storm, your mind is primed to see patterns in the chaos. A strange reflection on the water, a flicker of light in the distance, a distorted mirage on the horizon. Your brain doesn't interpret it as a trick of the light. It reaches for the only explanation it knows, the one that speaks to your deepest fears. You see a ghost, and once one person sees it, the power of suggestion takes over, and soon the whole crew shares the vision. So, does that solve it? Is the Flying Dutchman nothing more than a combination of atmospheric optics, bioluminescence, and maritime psychology? Have we, with the cool logic of science, finally exorcised the world's most famous ghost? For many, the answer is yes. The case is closed. But for others, the explanation feels incomplete. A mirage doesn't explain the sudden death of the sailor on the HMS Bacchante. A thermal inversion doesn't account for the sheer consistency of the sightings across centuries, cultures, and technologies. Science can explain the how, but it can't always explain the why. Why does this particular story persist? Why, even in our modern enlightened age, does the image of a lone spectral ship still send a shiver down our spine? The truth is, even if we can explain away every single sighting, we can't explain away the legend itself. Because the power of the Flying Dutchman was never just about a ship. It was about what that ship represented. It represented the ultimate human arrogance, the raw, untamed hubris of a man who looked at the awesome, terrifying power of nature, a force that had humbled kings and swallowed empires, and dared to spit in its face. Captain Decken, in that moment of screaming defiance, became more than a sailor. He became a symbol of humanity's eternal struggle against the limits of its own mortality, against the laws of God and physics. He declared he would round the Cape of Good Hope, even if it took him until Judgment Day. And in the cruelest twist of cosmic irony, the universe or God or the devil himself simply said, "As you wish." This is the psychological core of the legend, the part that truly chills us. The curse of the Flying Dutchman isn't a quick, merciful death. It's not the crushing deep or a splintered hull. It's worse. It's an eternity of almost home, almost at peace, almost finished with a journey that can never, ever end. Imagine the horror. To be forever sailing, forever battling the same phantom storm, your sails perpetually torn, your timbers groaning under the strain of a gale that never subsides. To see the lights of a distant shore, a phantom port that you can approach but never enter. To be a ghost in your own life, trapped in the single worst moment of your existence, replaying it over and over for centuries. This is a uniquely human fear. Not just the fear of death, but the fear of a meaningless, unending existence. It's the terror of being forgotten by time itself, cursed to be an observer of a world that has moved on without you. The crew of the Dutchman are not just specters, they are prisoners of the sea, their souls chained to the rotting planks of their ship. Their punishment is to become the very thing they tried to conquer, a permanent, terrifying fixture of the ocean's fury. And the ocean itself is the silent, central character in this entire saga. For millennia, we have stood at its edge, gazing out at a horizon that promises both infinite possibility and infinite peril. The sea is where fortunes are made and lives are lost. It is a vast, unknowable wilderness, a place of profound beauty and sudden, unspeakable violence. The Flying Dutchman is the personification of that duality. It is the ocean's anger given a name and a form. It is the ultimate ghost story for a species that spent most of its history dependent on, and terrified of, the water. Every sailor who ever lived understood this fragile contract with the sea. You respect its power, you heed its warnings, and you pray for safe passage. Decken broke that contract. He didn't just disrespect the ocean, he declared war on it. And so the legend became a cautionary tale, whispered in the flickering lantern light of taverns from Amsterdam to Cape Town. It was a story told to young, cocky sailors to remind them of their place in the world. It was a warning. No matter how strong your ship, no matter how skilled your crew, you are a guest in a kingdom that is not your own. And its king does not suffer fools. This is why the story refused to die. It was too potent, too resonant with our deepest anxieties. It sailed out of the realm of folklore and into the high art of Western culture. In 1843, the German composer Richard Wagner, himself inspired after a terrifyingly stormy sea voyage, immortalized the legend in his groundbreaking opera, Der Fliegende Holländer. He saw in the tale a profound story of damnation and the possibility of redemption through a woman's faithful love. a theme that would dominate his life's work. He took the sailor's ghost story and elevated it into a mythic tragedy. The legend seeped into literature, inspiring elements of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. With its cursed ship and spectral crew, it appeared in novels, in poems, and eventually on the silver screen. But for the modern audience, one portrayal has eclipsed all others. In Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean, the Flying Dutchman is reimagined as a monstrous organic vessel, fused with barnacles and sea life, captained by the tragic tentacled Davy Jones. While the details were changed, the curse born of a broken heart rather than blasphemy, the core elements remained. A captain, a curse, and a ship doomed to sail the seas for eternity, serving as a supernatural ferryman for those who die at sea. This reintroduction fired the legend directly into the heart of 21st century pop culture, ensuring that a whole new generation would know the name of that dreaded ghost ship. The story adapts because the fears it represents are timeless. We may no longer sail in wooden ships, fearing sea monsters and phantom gales. Our modern world is one of GPS, satellite communication, and massive container vessels that cross the ocean in days, not months. But have our fears really changed? Are we not still haunted by the consequences of our own hubris? We challenge nature with our technology, we push the boundaries of what's possible, and sometimes we are met with catastrophic failure. The Titanic, the unsinkable ship, was a modern monument to human arrogance, and its fate on a calm, starry night echoes the Dutchman's story. A sudden, brutal reminder that nature always has the final say. Perhaps the Flying Dutchman has simply changed its form. Today, it isn't a three-masted galleon appearing through the mist. It's the ghost in the machine. It's the endless, unwinnable argument on the internet. It's the feeling of being trapped in a job, a city, or a life that feels like a perpetual stormy journey with no port in sight. The curse of eternal, pointless struggle is a modern-day horror story that we can all understand. We all have our own phantom capes to round, our own personal storms that we fight again and again. In the end, it doesn't matter if a single sailor ever truly saw a spectral ship. The power of the Flying Dutchman was never about what was real. It was about what felt real to the human heart. It's a story about defiance, consequence, and the terror of eternal loneliness. It is a myth that we crafted from the salt spray, the whistling wind, and the deep dark water that holds so many of our secrets. It's a testament to the power of a story to endure, to change its sails and its rigging to suit the anxieties of any given era, but to always, always sail on. The ocean is quieter now. The age of sail is a distant memory, and the world is charted, mapped, and explored. But the legend remains. Because as long as there are dark nights in deep waters, as long as there are storms that rage and horizons that hide the unknown, we will tell stories to explain the unexplainable. We will look out into the darkness and wonder what's out there. And the ghost of a defiant Dutch captain and his cursed crew will be sailing there in our collective imagination, forever battling a storm of their own making, forever serving as a dark and timeless warning. A warning that some lines should never be crossed, and some oaths are better left unspoken, because on the high seas, and in the deep oceans of our own lives, there are some storms from which you can never ever return.